Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to talk about how the Stalinist regime created enemies. The reason why I talk about the creation of enemies is because the way in which Stalinism defined enemies, class enemies, internal and external, was based in obviously the Marxist-Leninist view of history and class struggle, and a great many of these enemies were largely fictitious, but they were men and women who inhabited classes which, in the view of Stalin and his contemporaries, contained the potential to be destabilizing to the new Soviet regime, and anything that offered that potential was clearly, in the eyes of Stalin, going to be counter-revolutionary. So dangerous social groups were likely to find some clever way of undoing the proletarian revolution and returning the country to some kind of czarist autocracy or capitalism or what have you. Similarly, enemies were external, circling the Soviet Union like sharks. Poland, Japan, Germany, Great Britain, America, all these dangerous threats, and as a result there was, in the eyes of conspiracy-minded Stalinists, a clear relationship between internal and external enemies. The extent to which this was true is doubtful. However, that it is also fair enough to say that hostile nations did surround the USSR, and the judgment that Stalin had, impaired though it was, wasn't completely paranoid. Previously, when we've talked about the development of show trials in the Soviet Union, we've focused on this idea that the shortcomings of the revolution could be explained away by saboteurs, by sabotage, by troublemakers, and the idea that the revolution itself was an incomplete or imperfect creation, that there were failings within Soviet communism that were in part germane to Russian culture and the economy and industrial infrastructure left behind from the Tsarist era, and also failings that were integral to communism itself. The idea that there were these imperfections was a form of heresy. Instead, any failings, any industrial accidents, failures to reach quotas and work norms, anything like this had to be explained away through internal enemies, and these fell into, firstly, social classes. As I said previously, the Soviet regime was able to create enemies out of social classes, and anyone it is suspected of being in any way conspiratorial against the state. So all classes, particularly the former nobles, the former bourgeoisie, priests and kulaks, were defined as class enemies. These were people who had not accepted the verdict of the revolution. They were angry at the loss of status, their loss of property, and now they were engaged in a secret, hidden struggle to gain back what they had lost. This is the official verdict. And the way this filters down into Soviet culture is that it creates an environment of permanent suspicion. You don't know who you're talking to. Some of the aristocracy and bourgeoisie had passed themselves off as proletarians in the chaos of the revolution and the civil war. They'd reinvented themselves as proletarian, managed to erase their past, create false papers, and they might present themselves externally as being working class, but the reality is, behind the mask there was a counter-revolutionary lurking. And there's all sorts of metaphors and language within Soviet discourse about examining what lies behind the mask. And Stalin uses this in many of his public pronouncements as well, about kulaks who may appear on the surface of things to now have accepted the revolution once they've been thrown in the gulags for a bit, but look behind the facade and there is a reactionary, a counter-revolutionary lurking there. These were class enemies. Obviously, the entire classes had been made oppositional, and the job from the late 1920s onwards was to liquidate as a class certain categories, certain kinds of class enemies, particularly the kulaks. The kulaks are a much bigger source of consternation to Stalin than the former nobility, because the kulaks number far larger groupings. The kulaks, obviously the wealthy peasants, outnumber any former nobles or former bourgeoisie many times over, and they had the potential, as Stalin was concerned, to hold the country to ransom, the country's food system to ransom, and could do far more damage than a hidden aristocrat could. In general, the fate of class enemies was firstly to deprive them of the economic base of their wealth or their status in society, as far as the Stalinists were concerned. The reason that kulaks existed was because of their ability to own property and their ability to accumulate wealth and exploit the poorer peasants. Not really that they did. The kulaks were not particularly the rural bourgeoisie or the rural exploiting class that Stalin suggested that they were. These were peasants who simply knew a bit more about farming, had been slightly more shrewd with their money and slightly less inclined to vodka, and so were more successful as a result. The destruction of them economically meant that they were unable to continue the previous way of earning a living, and therefore they were proletarianized. And that meant that the kind of social revolution that Stalin wanted to see in the countryside, which hadn't come in 1917, came after 1928. This wouldn't end here. During the anti-dekulakization campaigns that followed and accompanied the collectivization and eventually the Great Famine, the number of deportations, the removal of kulaks to gulags, the former kulaks become some of the bulk of gulag labour, or the labour that exists in colonies in exile. The ability of the NKVD, the security forces, to keep coming back and revisit the supposed crimes of the kulaks, even those that escape the net the first time around, are likely to be caught later on, and when the Great Terror comes along, there are anyone who is on a list or a ledger somewhere as a suspected kulak or class enemy is among the first to be arrested and in many cases executed. However, the destruction of the kulaks did not abate Stalin's paranoia. In fact, it actually fueled it. Stalin concluded that if any kulaks had got away, the mass murder of their friends and family, the destruction of their way of life, and the starvation of the Holodomor in the Ukraine, though not contained to the Ukraine, the famines weren't, obviously, that didn't really dispose them to the Soviet system particularly, and even a small handful of former kulaks could be terrifically dangerous. The person who had been the victim of dekulakization, was in Stalin's eyes going to be more desperate, more likely to lash out, to commit some act of terror, to be more angry than the normal kulak. The ability of kulaks to vanish from the countryside and re-emerge in the towns and cities, to reinvent themselves as workers, was deeply troubling to Stalin, because they could essentially go underground and become hidden enemies, far more dangerous. And this is kind of the mood music of Soviet thinking during the 20s and 30s. Hidden conspiracies, hidden threats. And it makes sense that the Soviets would think this, because before the revolution, the Bolshevik Party worked in a roughly similar way, a hidden conspiratorial revolutionary organisation that was utterly dedicated, utterly committed, and utterly ruthless. At internal party meetings on a local, regional and national level, that kind of conspiratorial thinking was retained. Party members were urged to keep utter secrecy about what happened during meetings, even if it was largely trivial stuff. The necessary conspiratorial behaviour that had once been needed in order to struggle against the Tsarist regime was difficult to kind of erase from Soviet thinking, even though it proved to some party members to be quite laughable. They legitimately asked, well, who are we engaged in a conspiracy against? Well, we have the power of the state behind us. We're not engaged in a conspiracy against the kulaks. They're engaged in a conspiracy against us. The other key feature of conspiratorial Soviet thinking was the fear of the capitalist world beyond Soviet borders. Stalin had three chief culprits for subversion in mind in the mid-1930s, where he saw war emanating from Germany, Poland and Japan, all of whom had close relation to the Soviet Union, and with, in the case of Japan and Poland, almost bordering the Soviet Union. Well, definitely bordering the Soviet Union in the case of Poland, and very close in a close proximity in the case of Japan. These were three powers which had dealt devastating blows on the Soviet Union, obviously Germany in the First World War, and Poland and Japan during the Russian Civil War period. It was the combination of these internal and external fears that led all Communist Party functioning to be shrouded in unnecessary secrecy throughout the 1920s and 30s. Procedures were introduced at the Politburo and the Central Committee in the 1920s, where documents would be sent out to local party branches, and they would have strict limitations placed on them as to who could actually read them, and they were required to be returned in a short period of time, in a few days. In 1938, this ended, and so one of the problems that the Soviet state has is in communications. There are party bosses, regional party bosses and local party bosses simply don't know what's going on when, after 1938 particularly, when important papers are not sent to them, so they are basing a lot of their decisions on guesswork. But at this point, at the height of the terror, the state is largely paralysed by the inability of people at a local or regional level to do anything at all, or even ask what it is they are meant to be doing, as all sorts of signals can be interpreted in different and potentially fatal ways. The minutes of the Central Control Commission were kept very tightly under wraps as well, and this meant that they were forbidden to be shown to anyone not on an approved list, or to be copied, to be spoken about in public or cited in any way, and the minutes had to be returned. Much of the time, they said nothing of any great controversy at all. Secrecy rules, even were coming down to repeating speeches in workplaces and factories that are meant to be secret, were these breaches of secrecy rules could be interpreted as class treachery, a betrayal of the proletariat, and at certain points in the height of the terror, this is extremely dangerous. Not just the party, but government, and the two really bleed into each other in the mid-30s. But government itself began to be pervaded with secrecy and paranoia. The classified, the number of things that were labelled as classified or top secret grew and grew and grew. It became easy for the little Stalins, the bureaucrats, who with a rubber stamp wielded power far beyond their status or ability, to simply designate a thing as secret or top secret on a whim to show their significance and power, or simply to inconvenience rivals, or just out of sheer bloody-mindedness. So the number of things that become top secret grow and grow. Party communications, military mobilisation plans, defence industry construction, the export of precious metals, important inventions, OGPU reports on the mood of the population and other matters, prosecutions under Article 58 of the Criminal Code, which dealt with crimes against the state, administrative exile, deportation, and special settlements. These, Sheila Fitzpatrick writes in her book Everyday Stalinism, were all areas that could be listed as top secret. She adds, strikes and workers' protests were also classified topics, though at the lower level of not for publication, and reports on the cases of plague, cholera, typhus and other infectious diseases were classified as well. In the early days of the revolution, the use of terror was seen not as a guilty secret, but something that needed to be embraced, and even something that was justifiable. A revolution was happening, and a number of key individuals had to be liquidated in order for that revolution to happen, and the revolution would bring about such significant benefits for the lives of Soviet people in the future that this was all justifiable. Nikolai Bukharin, for example, in around 1920 said that terror was a method of creating communist mankind out of the human materials of the capitalist epoch. But by the mid-1930s, this enthusiasm for terror has changed. Instead of there being a rather bold, outspoken advocacy for terror, there is evasion and secrecy. There's obviously far more terror on a far greater scale during the 1930s than during the early revolutionary period. However, it is secret. There are all sorts of anecdotal evidence, bits of anecdotal evidence in the diaries of Gulag survivors about the secrecy with which they were transported to the gulags. There were trains passing through towns at night and pulling into stations in the small hours of the morning when there was the least chance of Soviet citizens working out who was on the cattle trains and who was in the cattle trucks and where they were going. And the journeys to gulags took an incredibly long time for some prisoners who were often taken on long train journeys and then route marches. Getting to the Gulag was an expedition in itself. and the reasons for, well, at least some of the reasons for situating the gulags far out of the way was that of official secrecy. The Soviets were blessed with having a large country in which to place their enemies. Some acts of state repression, not necessarily terror, but state repression, were not necessarily seen as dirty secrets, but were championed as part of the development or the rebuilding of society in process. Things like the great public works schemes using slave labour, such as the Bellemont Canal, the White Sea Canal, which was credited with reforging the souls of wayward and miscreant class enemies who were then put to work on the canal. This was widely publicised. Writers such as Konstantin Simonov and Maxim Gorky wrote in glowing terms about the wonders of the White Sea Canal project. They ignored the 20,000 people who died digging the White Sea Canal and suggested that this Stalinist vanity project was the sort of thing that was going to reforge the soul. But of course, for prisoners who were publicised in this way, they were the minority. Most of the treatment of prisoners of the NKVD was highly secretive. The men and women who were arrested by the NKVD on release were forced to sign documents vowing never to speak in public about what had happened to them. And they were helped in this regard by a public that by and large did not wish to know. There was a widespread knowledge that things did go on in the Soviet Union, but by and large they happened to people who deserved them and who had done things and transgressed against not just the state but against the working class itself. And so these were people, dangerous individuals that could do with locking up, and this would all be probably quite a good thing. And it was really quite convenient to buy into state propaganda because it told a compelling story. The difficult individual who had survived from the previous times, which were all rotten and corrupt, into the glorious shining People's Republic, was now seeking to overthrow it, and only swift action from Stalin and people like Yezhov or Beria would save the revolution. And this is a nice, attractive story if you don't have to delve into it very far and look at its flagrant fabrication or its various contradictions. Instead, you simply embrace it, and it helps any troubling moral questions to be swept away. It also sometimes enables you to get a nice new apartment if you denounce your class enemy next door neighbour. Anyway, I'll finish there. I hope you found this useful, and pop by the Explaining History Facebook page. We've got some great chats going on there, and I'll look forward to speaking to you all soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.